Hello there, Golden Bears, and welcome back. We're getting closer and closer to the end of this Module 9. In fact, we only go to not Module 9-4. So, woohoo! Holla! Here it comes to the end. So we're going to discuss the concept of something that's been part of our conversation since time period 8 and time period 9, this idea of the Cold War. Starting with the end of World War II, all the way up to basically 1989, America has been at odds primarily with communist countries and Russia, to be exact. That is about to come to an end in this scenario. In 1987, President Reagan had gone to visit an area of Berlin. If you remember, Germany had been bisected at the end of World War II into, but quad-sected into 4 different regions, and with all sorts of complications and rattle sabering between the NATO alliance and the Warsaw Pact, Berlin basically got cut up. And in that, there was a wall in 1961 that was constructed that really bisected the entire town of Berlin, with one side being free and the other side being communist. And that wall remained in place as a symbolic gesture of the separation between America and Russia, or communism versus democracy. 2 years before that, there was a newly elected premier. It would be the name of his name went by Mr. Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev came on the scene and talked about this thing called glasnost and perestroika, glasnost being openness, perestroika being the changing of the economy. And these ideas began to ring true and ring a sense of hopefulness that maybe Russia might begin changing some of its practices and policies. If nothing else, willing to accept acknowledgement of wrongdoing in the prior time periods under Stalin, under Lenin, and even their predecessor or the subsequent followers after him. So here we are, President Lincoln standing there, yes, at a staged showing of American, public media. But it says, there is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Pause for applause. There were about 50 or 60 people there that were all kind of paid and members of the president's staff. If you watch the video, they're all waving these little flags, and the camera's only focusing on this small little narrow band of people. Everything else, there was no one around if you were to watch the full wide lens. And then people living there in West Germany, they were kept a good quarter of a mile away for protection of the president and other types of things. But he then finally, after a long pause, says again, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And this is essentially what we're going to be talking about today, is what does it mean then for America and the world when they tear down this wall? Here is the worksheet that you're going to want to be focusing on for this time period here, in terms of how the new right and state politics are defined during this time. And with that, I want to tell a little brief story in terms of what, my experiences. There are a lot of seminal or important dates that you could maybe think of for your generation and age group. Is probably when in that day of March when they said, we're going to be going away for a week or two because of this COVID-19 thing. And the next thing we know, 14 months later, we're still kind of, folks are still sitting at home not knowing what was happening and where it was going because of that pandemic. I'm sure you were sitting, wondering where you were. Most of you are probably in class when you're realizing that you might not be coming back to school in that situation. But I can't really think of anything else significant that had happened. Maybe if you'd watched some SpaceX launchings and landings, that's rather pretty dramatic. Or the landing of the rover on Mars, etc. That you might remember. But I can remember distinctly where I was a couple times in my life. First of all, one with the Halley's Comet in 1986. That was something that was significant for me to remember because I don't know why. It was just something that was significant to me. I can remember in January in 1986 when the Space Shuttle Columbia had exploded. I was there at school, second period. This had been, I think, second period, and all the news cycle, like on campus, the scuttlebutt was like, oh my gosh, did you hear? Did you hear? Now, we didn't have TVs in the classroom, so we had to kind of wait until we got home, but all of us were in shock of like what had taken place. The next thing was when I was in college, and I can remember when this idea of November 9th, and I accidentally wrote the wrong date on there. It should be 1989. I was a senior in college, and here the fall of the Berlin Wall actually did take place, where quite a few circumstances came together we'll talk about that enabled actual people to go up and start jackhammering and taking sledgehammers and breaking down this wall. Tiananmen Square, I can remember in May of 1989 also take place. It was like, oh my gosh, going into my senior year, there was of college. There was tons of change happening on the global scale at this time, and so this on one hand is great news, but on the other hand, it did create kind of challenges as to like the vacuum, like when Russia left, that left like no police force over half the world. And what did that mean? It gave opportunity for maybe crime or terrorist organizations, etc., to fill in that vacuum left by the political absence of their presence. Well, in class, we're going to talk about the rise of Bush Sr., the dad, and he in his growth and continuation of often many of the Ronald Reagan policies. So George H. Herbert Walker Bush, that's the senior, number 41, I'm sorry, number 41. He was vice president for President Reagan for both of those terms. And since Reagan seemed to do a decent job, the Republicans managed to not to have too many problems or too many scandals, if you will. The American people voted for Herbert Walker Bush, and it was an easy job, and his counterpart running for the Democratic ticket seemed weak in a lot of different areas. And so here Bush found himself walking into something that was rather tricky. First trickiness is as he was running for office, for president, he kept saying, I have a hard stance on crime, a hard stance on immigration. I want to make sure our budget is balanced. And he ran on a couple of these platform ideas. Well, one phrase that he kept saying over and over again is like, read my lips, there will be no new taxes. And most Republicans love to hear that, and conservatives to the like. And yet, the moment he took office, because of the large ballooning budget that Reagan had left him with, remember, because the SDI and because of America's spending more on any things in the military than any other budget up to this point in time. We're talking even World War II, we're talking World War I, we're talking Vietnam, that under Reagan in those 8 years that we had ballooned the budget of our military, that came at a crisis mode. And in order to help balance the budget and to steer America away from perhaps even going bankrupt, he had to make some choices, and that was essentially to raise taxes and bring about this way to reduce unemployment and reduce inflation that was beginning to kind of hit across the landscape of America, at least by 1991 and 1992 during that time. So these programs kind of did work, but ultimately many Americans were disgruntled with this new guy coming in, that he had kept his word during this time. But something significant that he had done, and this is a marvel, is that he enacted something that was very similar to LBJ's Civil Rights Act of 1964, is that in 1990, he signs this America with Disabilities Act that essentially gives power to those with disabilities to force cities and governments and businesses, etc., to comply with various access that they require. And this is why you see ramps everywhere. You'll see special elevators, you'll see special showers, special bathrooms, special hotel rooms, special campsites, you name it. All of these things came about simply because of this ADA. I want to say simply, but this forced their hand in order to improve the quality of life for many of those with disabilities. And many conservatives were like aghast, like, why would we do something like this? But it does show you his desire to create a presidency that was both compassionate and concerned, kind of like this idea of kindler and gentler, what he's been running on. Excuse that, someone was calling in at this time. So here I have some political cartoons that on the left-hand side is here we, in 2018, America was going through so many challenges and concerns with things, and here you see Uncle Sam. They're kneeling at the bust, the head bust of Herbert Walker Bush, saying a kindler and gentler nation, and he's quipping, boy, that certainly sounds inviting right now. Well, at the same time, in the lower right-hand corner is a very political cartoon, and I hope that you don't take it too far from this, nor of it be a conveyance of that I'm supporting of these types of ideas. But this is a political cartoon. I'm trying to provide some balance to, how many people in America viewed Bush, and that is he wanted a kinder and gentler nation, but he also supported the gun lobby and the sales of arms to foreign countries, and we'll talk about the Noriega and others later on. But he was also against abortion, and then what does this do? It forces many girls to make choices to seek outside means in order to provide choices for themselves. So is this a kindler and gentler nation then or now? That was the hope that Herbert Walker Bush wanted to create at that time. Well, during this same time, we see again, he had the ADA Act that he passed. He then also signed into something that called the Clean Air Act that was certainly unique to a Republican president. We haven't seen the likes of this since Nixon was trying to pass environmental law acts in order to help make sure that the counterculturalists, etc., weren't so up in arms over his policies. And so this Clean Air Act was a very important act to force car manufacturers and other factories to work harder at finding ways to eliminate their emissions, but also the acknowledgement that these carbon dioxides are going into the atmosphere, creating problems with the ozone layer and emissions that will create the global warming aspect that has become very, very important during this time. And then also during his early stint as president, George Thurgood Marshall, Mr. Thurgood Marshall, our black American on the bench, he passes, and President Bush then has an opportunity of choosing another replacement to fill his vacancy. So he nominates Clarence Thomas, a black man of gifted talent who was incredibly conservative in his viewpoints. He, in fact, was against affirmative action. He felt it did more harm to the black culture and community than it did help. He believed in a reduce of government. He was anti-abortion. He was very, very conservative. And, that in and of itself might have been hard to be having him approved for the nomination. But 3 days before the vote was supposed to be cast, this gal arrives. Her name was Anita Hill, and she began bringing forward allegations of sexual improprieties, both towards her and towards others. And now remember, when you go before the Senate Judiciary Committee, all you need to have is words, and evidence is hopefully going to be determined. But they wanted to use this as a show of strength. Why? Because even though Walker Bush was president, he didn't have control of the Congress. The Congress was held by Democrats. And so this Judiciary Committee then spent, almost 100 hours, not in in continuity, but broken up over 3 days in taking testimony from both sides. In class, we're going to debate this, and if you would have found him innocent or guilty, but either way, the nomination of Clarence Thomas was not easy, but eventually did result in his acceptance. What did this do? It really began to continue to raise awareness for the women's movement and how much more growth is needed and much more stringent laws to protect the women's struggle for equal rights in this time and continuing still to this day. So here's a picture of Anita Hill, who herself was an aide under him. She was a college professor of law, sharp gal. And interestingly enough, there on the left-hand side, I'll highlight right here, is Senator Joe Biden, who now is our current 45th or 46th President of the United States. Well, let us leave the kinder and gentler conservatism that was brought forward by Herbert Walker Bush. Now let's talk about what events were happening around his 4 years of office. First, we have, starting way back in 1980s, there is this Polish guy here that Welles Lockley, that was trying to try to get people to join this union, if you will. And this trade union grew to almost 10 million people. Now, you'd like to think communist country, communist government, that they would be in favor of the Labor and Working Party. Well, the challenge is this labor and working movement kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they were actually calling for more democratic choices, not more communist type of choices. And so the Soviet Union began cracking down on them and trying to break this up. But by 1989, Lockley and the Solidarity movement reminded and continued to cajole Gorbachev and saying, look, you asked for openness and glasnost, you asked for economic changes under Perestroika, why can't we do this? And it was there that Gorbachev announced that all nations in the Warsaw Pact, I mean like 16 of them if I'm not mistaken, have the luxury of choosing their own sovereignty. What did this do? It immediately began triggering in a course of events where boom after boom, like a domino effect, nation after nation left the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and their influence and began creating their own type of free elections and their own constitutions. Some call this, a bloodless revolution. Some historians called it the Velvet Revolution, how smoothly it went during that time. So this then summarily concludes the Berlin Wall, symbolically talking about the collapse of Russia and the Soviet Union. Here you see that gate on the left-hand side saying, warning, warning, this is, West Berlin, and it's closed off to people. And here you have it on the right-hand side. People now can walk back and forth freely through that gate, symbolizing the end of that wall. Well, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, we begin seeing, again, like I alluded to, it's like, I guess an example would be, the other day I was driving along this 2-lane highway up towards Bishop, Highway 395. And I know from friends of mine who are CHP officers that there is a huge stretches of road there, and there's only so many CHP officers per hundreds of miles along that. So interestingly enough, there was one that passed me in this direction, and I was going that way, not just me, but the whole group of us. And I knew immediately, once that cop goes this way, there's nothing that's going to be turning that homeboy or homegirl around to come back this way. And what did that do? That resulted on me pressing on the accelerator probably 10 miles an hour faster, thinking you got to get fish in there even sooner. And so why I share with you that illustration is that, when there's no policing agency, when there's no government agency in keeping you accountable or keeping you within your boundaries, you are going to, probably press out against this type of thing. And so this is what we're going to begin seeing across the landscape of the globe, is Russia is now leaving their posts, giving up Afghanistan. And then you're going to see things in Poland taking place. You're going to see things in China taking place, things in Panama taking place, crossover, because why? The big daddies aren't there to watch them anymore, just like the CHP isn't there to watch them. So with the departure of Gorbachev, pulling out the Russian troops that had been in Afghanistan for, I think, almost 20 some years, this destabilized them tremendously. And so who comes into power? Well, a group of that call themselves the Taliban, who were religious or very theologically conservative. They call themselves the Sunnis. And what made it really challenging of these Taliban is that they eliminated all that. So the Russians were really cool. The communists were really cool. They elevated the role of women, elevated equality, elevated equal pay amongst different people. They had built schools. So when Russia was there, it wasn't that bad in some ways. It's just that America loved to portray it as bad. Well, when they left, and then here come the Taliban, they immediately began denigrating and women. And in fact, one such woman, this Malala, stood up for the rights of women and girls to go to school again. And what did they do? They busted a cap on her head to make this be a symbolic gesture of how women under the Taliban should never have a voice in public and have access to professional opportunities like they had for the past 20-some years under the Russian, if you want to call it, regime. And then, as some of you know, you've heard of Al-Qaeda, you've heard of Bin Laden. The Taliban and Afghanistan then became a safe haven, if you will, for different terrorist networks that were Muslim, very conservative Muslim, interpreted the Quran very contrary to what most Shiite Muslims or most what would be cosmopolitan Muslims would think, that the Quran is really a peaceful document, but they found verses, for the lack of a better word, in the Quran that's basically said it's appropriate to kill infidels and those who do not believe in Muhammad. And so Afghanistan became a place where Al-Qaeda and other terrorist networks had a place to roam freely, to train, and to plan and mastermind what you all know as 9/11, etc. So with post 9/11 taking place in 2001, here you see a picture of the different areas, and I want to show you up here here's Afghanistan. This is where you see various groups or organizations that were part of the Al-Qaeda network, where there were predominant allowances for them to be there, whether because America and Russia had pulled out of those regions and it destabilized them tremendously during that time of Bush, and giving them an opportunity to begin just saying, hey, yeah, sure, the police are gone. Let's just, whoever's the strongest can kind of run that country at the time. So back at Russia, so we've talked about the various countries under the Warsaw Pact that were able to have free and open elections. What did this mean for Russia? Well, Gorbachev had opened up a big bag of all sorts of things in there. And interestingly enough, because of the glasnost and this idea of openness, elections were held, and this threatened Gorbachev's power. Why? Well, because we see some on one side that are very diehard military people saying, I can't believe we have this guy here in power that wants us to hand over the keys to our missiles. And then you have other groups of people who are like, it's about time, we need democracy here. So with that, it essentially brought in three different people groups. And what did this do? It minimized his election power. And soon he found that it was barely able for him to hold on to preserving the power there in Russia. And so soon, in a matter of months, he is put under house arrest. Another one of his proteges, Boris Yeltsin, comes into power. Boris Yeltsin begins to removing different symbols of communism from their country, begins to label these things a Commonwealth independent of states. And what does this mean? On Christmas morning, Gorbachev resigns, leaving Russia to be dissolved on the following day. And again, yet another power vacuum of what is going to happen to Russia. How will Boris Yeltsin lead? What will this look like in the years to come? But why is this significant? The Cold War has officially ended. So from 1946, when you had the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference with the Big Three meeting there, all the way to now, that Cold War is here. So here's a little map that you can see all these situations in Russia or influences by Russia here in these boxes as to when there were some challenges to the power of Russia. What I really want to point out for you is, why is it that you have Germany? Why is it that you have Poland? Okay, I put these little arrows here. Why is it that those are the first two countries that are basically saying, you know what, we want greater freedoms and we want greater liberties? We'll talk about that in class when we get there, but you should just think about that and look to this idea. Think geography. Here's Moscow. Here's Germany and Berlin. Here's Western Europe and democracy. All right, maybe that'll help you with enough of a clue as we do that. The third thing that we want to talk about is this idea of globalization. And now that the world major leaders have, Russia has disappeared. Communism seems to be fading. I'm not saying China isn't still a power broker, but they haven't grown strong until like the mid 2000s, etc. Okay, the new phrase is, how can we collaborate? How can we work together? Business partners can't be enemies. And so this is the mindset that hits the landscape of it. And so this new cooperation between capitalist and communist governments really takes on a new flavor. I love this political cartoon. Here you see the current president, if you want to call him that. Many of them call him a czar. Okay, here you see is Putin sitting down with his shirt off because he always wants to show off his muscles, etc. And he's arm wrestling, and so you see Merkel from Germany, you see the Italian guy, you see the Canadian guy. Here's Obama in the very, very back, and here you see Abe from Japan, just like kind of going, I'm so disinterested in what's taking place right now. And here is Putin saying, all right, next. I'm going to make sure that you guys, do what I want as part of the summit, not what you want. And so these G8 summits are there to develop camaraderie and how can business and politicians and how can humanitarian aid and all those things work together to bring about a good for the common order. Another thing we begin seeing to emerge is multinational corporations exploding to this time, and I'm going to show you on the next slide some of those examples of this time. And so there were some positive effects of these things. We see, for instance, people eating McDonald's for the first time. Not sure if that's good or bad. You see Walmart, over 1,200 new stores going across the globe. Good or bad, it's there. These positive access to goods is helpful. You have different media access from BBC from England, or you have Al Jazeera, the Muslim Saudi Arabian information that's going around. So this is some positive effects. Music, you see television shows and the effect that it had on how people see America. It's kind of a cool effect. However, there's some negative aspects that this globalization brings, because these corporations are looking for making money, show me the money. They also aren't responsible to the laws. And so in America, as you know, we've worked hard since the Progressive Era to make sure that the workers have certain rights, and that in the 60s and 70s that the Clean Water and the Clean Air Act and the environmental EPA and stuff were passed to clean up our rivers and the air. Well, with these new developing countries, none of those places were in effect. And so what did this mean? Well, these countries got to do what America got to do. That is basically start treating their rivers and their air and their timber forests and other resources horribly. Now, I don't have time to go into that, but in class we would then spend greater amount of time talking about the strengths and demerits of this type of thing. But Another thing that you need to realize is that organized labor, although they were paid more, let's just say in Vietnam, as a result of these new factories coming in to maybe build, create, and sell more shirts and clothing, but they were woefully paid much, much less than Americans. And what did this mean? Is it was better for American companies to go have the shirts made in Vietnam rather than here in America, just to save money in that. So quite a few pros and cons of sorts during this time. So I love this picture of this Kentucky Fried Chicken, and there they are in China next to a soldier with a replica of Colonel Sanders. How trippy that must seem, and that branding must seem for the Chinese people coming in and around buying chicken from an American icon, if you will. But this tells us a thawing of relations, and again, if you're business partners, you often don't go to war. And that's kind of, I guess, I like to say is the beauty of globalization, is it keeps our countries hopefully working together rather than fighting against one another. Well, because of this globalization, this new world order, and this rapid industrialization, and the negative impact that I talked about with the ruining of our environment and gases going into the air and these factories having no repercussions of what they're doing. This causes some major crisis of the global warming or climate change. And I'm not going to get into the politics of this if you agree or disagree with this, but generally speaking, most scientists say yes, the polar ice caps are shrinking and they are threatening human survival on the planet. They projected even certain years as to when this planet will be at its biggest crisis mode in that. And so there have been different protocols dating all the way back in the 70s to begin making awareness of this stuff. But there was a Kyoto Protocol, whereas Kyoto in Japan, it's a beautiful city. I regret when I was in Japan not going all that way from Tokyo to taking the train down to visit Kyoto. But look at that Buddhist shrine there in this old neighborhood there on the left-hand side. Just a beautiful town that has UNESCO World Heritage distinction there. And at that same place, which is beautiful, then here you have a Herbert Walker Bush on the right-hand side in a political cartoon. Again, remember, political. I'm just trying to find cartoons that show maybe both sides of the picture here. Here he's burning the Kyoto Protocol. Notice the smokestack acting as a cigar, and then you can see in the cigar box is the U.S. industry, meaning that's who influences decisions. Why would America, why would the United States Senate not ratify to curtail these greenhouse emissions? Because, don't we want to save the world after all? Well, essentially they believed it would create an unfair playing advantage for China, or an unfair playing advantage for some of these emerging countries, that if America has to abide by them, which we had been trying hard to do, yet the others don't, that's going to make it to where nobody can afford to buy American-made goods because they're doing them cheaper than we are. So there's some pros and cons as to the terms of this Kyoto Protocol as to why it was or was not signed by our United States Senate. And then the next point that we want to touch upon is, how does America play a role in managing conflicts after the Cold War? Is it our job to be the police force? Is it our job to be, I guess, the the superpowers, if you will, to monitor over the rest of the world? And it seems to be that has been the role that America had taken during the absence of Russia. And China still wasn't quite as strong as they are now. And so in this, we're going to begin looking at what was taking place in China, what was taking place in Poland, what was taking place in Nicaragua and other regions during this time. Remember, back to my illustration, when the cop drives that way, and I know that there's not another one for 300 miles, I tend to put on the accelerator a little bit faster on the car. This is kind of the same mindset here. And so in China, because of what they're hearing taking place across the landscape of this idea of democracy, China began holding large-scale protests. We're talking the tune of 200,000 plus people in this Tiananmen Square. And made famous is this guy called the Tank Man. And up to this point, over here you can see buses have been burned. What you don't see are effigies, not effigies, but paper mache of the Statue of Liberty. What you don't see are college professors and college students and all these people trying to find a way to have openness, just like what was taking place in Russia. Okay, this openness idea, these reforms necessary. This tank man, and what you don't see is about a line of about 50, no, maybe 20 tanks, all in unison coming in to do what? Well, to calm the disturbance. But remember, these are their people. This is like a civil war maybe on the brink of happening. This tank man stands in the way of this tank, and every time the tank would turn, he would then move that way with it to get in front of it. What incredible bravery. This man didn't know if they were going to pull out a quick gun and boop, boop, boop. They didn't know if they would be blasted with the tank. They didn't know if they would just run over him. Just an incredible vision of how important democracy was to the Chinese people. Sadly, Xiaoping, who was the leader of China at the time, he called the military in and asked them to crush this disturbance down and squash it as fast as he could. He did promise a few reforms, but no reforms had happened during that time as a result of this. Okay, as a result of this, America tried to stop selling items to China and doing trade with them, but oh man, America and China are so uniquely tied together in terms of economics that it was a hard thing to extract ourselves from that. Well, around that same time, we have a thing going on in Panama. Now, Panama, if you remember Ford, Gerald Ford or Carter, it's Carter who signed off Panama back to the Panamanians in 1999. But during this time, again, America is always trying to have in our backyard people who are friendly to the American cause. And so in this friendliness, we have a guy who we felt has been a friend of ours for some time, Manuel Noriega. Here you see Vice President Bush right here. He's chilling with Noriega over in this corner here. You might not be able to see him. I'll try to move myself there. Here they're just having conversations about how can America be best involved in what's taking place in the South. Well, Noriega begins kind of playing one against the other. Who is that? America and the drug cartels. And so on one hand, he's helping America bust the drugs and the cocaine coming in. But on the other hand, he's helping the drug cartels launder money through his banks and other stuff. And so President Bush declares Operation Just Cause and moves in a matter of a few days. Here you can see the dark spot is the ocean part. Here you can see the land isthmus of Panama. And it literally, not but a few days, it takes about 27,000 of our Marines to move in, capture Noriega, take him back to Florida, where he's eventually found guilty of selling drugs to America. Is this politics? Yes. Why? What did we do? Essentially, America used this as a chance to get rid of a guy who we didn't really trust anymore and bring in their own government that I guess we trusted a little bit better. Well, if you remember back to Reagan, he was, for his 8 years, was always trying to have Iran and Iraq and other kind of people in the Middle East to kind of work against each other. So he would sell weapons to both. He would support both sides. And this made sure that neither side can become too powerful. Well, during this time, when Iran began having some of a crisis of its own, up emerged a new guy named Saddam Hussein in Iraq, who said, we're never going to be making money because America keeps putting embargoes on us and doesn't allow us to have access to banks. Why are banks important? Because everything in the oil industry is done in dollars, and so if you can't trade in dollars, your country is struggling. So he makes a choice, Saddam Hussein makes a choice to actually invade Kuwait. This then triggers President Bush to saying that Iraq, that we're not going to stand for this. You need to leave. He gave him about, 4 months. He said, I think the date was the 15th of January. Says, you have this much time to leave when you've come in. If not, we're going to invade. Now, what made President Bush rather smart in this situation is that he didn't want the rest of the world to be thinking this is just all about oil and just about power grab, etc. What did he do is he went to the United Nations and he convinced the United Nations to say this is a worthwhile event for us to get involved with. And we had, I think, close to 40 nations, 38 for sure, some of them even Muslim nations, joining in to the invasion of Iraq to make sure that they leave Kuwait and return the balance back to the Middle East. Why was this important? Well, if Iraq had beat Kuwait, the next country in line was Saudi Arabia. Ooh, America got half their oil from Saudi Arabia. I don't think, again, America wanted that to take place. Here you see some pictures of fighter jets. This is a coalition of fighter jets. You'll notice they have different flags on the tail sections of them, commemorating, that this war was not necessarily about an American war, but it was certainly a war that the Middle East was helped to bring stabilization. Here you can see the background are every one of these are oil wells that were destroyed by the Iraqi Republican Guard and destroyed before the war had begun, just to create contamination and problems in the region of Kuwait there. As ultimately, Desert Storm had begun. I kind of jumped a little too quickly on that, and literally in a matter of 1 month, we had 40 countries bombing sections of Iraq to try and deplete their power and their strength. And it was an incredible success story. And after that month of bombing, we brought in, not we, but the United Nations brought in close to 700,000 troops, if I think correctly, to take out the Republican Guard army that mounted, they said, up to 1 million members were on it, and they were defeated rather quickly to restore power to that. So here you can see a picture of the Desert Storm by ground, and notice every different kind of country here that was represented by that. You don't see hardly any American flags there, but I know that we were involved in that situation. Well, not everybody was happy at home. There were some that thought it was very interesting and ironic that President Bush had given January 15th as the day in which that Saddam Hussein should surrender. Why? Because this is to commemorate Martin Luther King Day, who was a critic of U.S. militarism, critic of using violence to create your way. And so I think it's important for us to kind of be mindful that civil rights impact is still real and strong in America, and sometimes America loses sight of that, especially in these geopolitical arenas there, and for reasons that were they valid for us to be involved with oil? Was it valid for us to help be part of the policing agent of the Middle East and the rest of the world? That was just kind of a situation. Now let me blast through these rather quickly because we're at some 40-some minutes, and my apologies of how much I'm talking on this. But another conflict that took place was a good note is in 1993. If you remember in my prior lecture, there was a group of people called the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, under not Anwar Sadat. I'm drawing a name, and I can't remember his name. I can even visualize him, but nonetheless, they were the ones that were hijacking planes, hijacking boats. The PLO were, and so these two Israelis and Palestinians came together under Bush's watch, and they signed an agreement together, basically creating a recognition that Palestine should have their ability to be a self-governing movement. A good success point for President Bush at that time. Well, on another sad note, however, we have movements in other parts of the world that are being kind of ignored or not helped. In South Africa and apartheid. I wish I had more time to talk about that. But the South Afrikaners, it's like I talked about in the last lecture, but that apartheid system finally had come to an end in 1994, where democracy was restored. And if you remember Desmond Tutu, and if you remember F.W. Clerk, which was the president, and for sure, if you can remember, again, I'm drawing a blank. This must be my COVID coming into place. I can visualize him. Nelson Mandela, they finally had a chance to restore balance in there, and South Africa now is held by Nelson Mandela. El Salvador, the same type of thing. The problems they were having there restored back to democracy. In Chile, and Pinochet, and how he was killing people who spoke out against him, he was booted out of power and brought in more of a democratic type of government. So incredible success points under Herbert Walker Bush Sr. Yet during this time, the economy at home is suffering, and this is going to cause many people to be very frustrated. I, for one, was one, because economy was not doing well, paying for all these different wars. Unemployment was starting to happen. There was inflation was going on, and so there were a lot of people who said it was time for change. And who is going to begin creating this change? It's going to be a name as Clinton. Bill Clinton will become the one that we'll talk about in our next one. So with that, the end of the Cold War happens with Reagan ushering it in, but the one who really helped massage it in his 4 years of office, the one who really helped carry it along, was that of his successor, Herbert Walker Bush. And he then had to figure out, what is it like to govern and lead in a world of a global order when there is no other major superpower to keep the balance in this. And many people look to America to be the leader in the world and trying to bring some sense to the commotion at hand. So with that, Golden Bears, keep it classy. You're amazing, and we'll be seeing you next time.